When swords were sheathed, history was not. The Battle of Badr ended on the sands of a quiet valley, but its consequences did not remain there. As the Muslim army turned back toward Medina, no banners were raised in celebration. There were no songs of triumph. The road back was marked instead by reflection, silence, and an unfamiliar weight, the weight of responsibility. For the first time since the Hijrah, the believers were not simply survivors. They were victors. And victory, as the Quran would soon teach them, can be more dangerous than defeat if it is not guided by revelation. The return to Medina, a city transformed. Ibn Ishaq records that the Prophet, peace be upon him, entered Medina quietly. There was no dramatic announcement, no public display of power. Instead, the city itself responded. Families waited anxiously for names. Mothers listened for footsteps. Some hearts rejoiced, others shattered in grief. For the martyrs of Badr, there would be no worldly compensation, but their sacrifice elevated them permanently in the sight of Allah. The Prophet, peace be upon him, personally honored them, naming them, remembering them, and establishing that martyrdom was not loss, but elevation. Medina itself felt different. Before Badr, Islam had been one voice among many. After Badr, Islam became the axis around which Medina turned. Islam as authority, not minority. Ibn Kathir explains that Badr marked the first moment when Islam transitioned from community to authority. Before, Islam sought protection, treaties were defensive, enemies underestimated the believers. After, Islam commanded attention. Treaties carried weight. Neutrality began to disappear. This shift created opportunities and enemies. Victory clarified lines that had once been blurred. Surah Al-Anfāl, revelation as governance. Unlike other historical victories, Badr was not left to human interpretation. Allah revealed Surah Al-Anfāl not to glorify the Muslims, but to discipline them. The opening verse immediately redirected authority. They ask you about the spoils of war. Say, the spoils belong to Allah and the Messenger. This was revolutionary. In tribal Arabia, victory meant entitlement. In Islam, victory meant accountability. Ibn Kathir notes that this surah laid the foundations of Islamic statecraft: obedience over opinion, unity over entitlement, revelation over emotion. Allah was teaching the believers that success without submission leads to collapse. The question of spoils, a test of hearts. The companions had never faced this situation before. Some had pursued the enemy. Some had guarded the Prophet, peace be upon him. Some had gathered equipment. Each role was essential. But who deserved more? Instead of allowing division to grow, Allah removed the discussion entirely from human hands. Distribution would not be decided by strength, status, or proximity, but by divine command. This moment protected the Ummah from internal fracture at its birth. The prisoners of Badr, a moral turning point. Perhaps no aspect of the aftermath reveals Islam's civilizational vision more clearly than the treatment of prisoners. These men were not strangers. Many had tortured Muslims in Makkah. Some had driven families into exile. Others had mocked, beaten, and starved believers. Yet when they arrived in Medina as captives, something unprecedented occurred. Ibn Sa'd and Ibn Ishaq both narrate that prisoners were housed among Muslim families, not imprisoned in chains. The Ansar fed them what little they had, sometimes giving prisoners bread while they themselves survived on dates. This behavior was not cultural, it was Qur'anic. And they give food, despite love for it, to the needy, the orphan, and the captive. The prisoners of Badr experienced Islam not as conquerors, but as moral reformers. 70 captives, many responsible for torture and exile, were now under Muslim control. Historical sources, including Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Sa'd, describe how prisoners were provided food equal to the companions' meals. Families of martyrs and soldiers shared provisions. Compassion was displayed without compromising authority. Some prisoners later embraced Islam, not by coercion, but through witnessing the Prophet's peace be upon him, integrity, and mercy. Ibn Kathir notes that this moment set a standard for ethical conduct in warfare, which was unprecedented in Arabia. Consultation and leadership, a model for all ages. The Prophet, peace be upon him, did not rule alone. He consulted Abu Bakr and Umar principle of governance. Radiyallahu anhu openly, modeling shura as a permanent mercy, was advocated. Firmness was considered. Revelation later guided the final framework. Allah corrected the outcome, but not the process. This distinction is critical. Islam does not suppress thought, it guides it. Divine correction without humiliation. Later verses of Surah Al-Anfāl address the prisoner decision with clarity and wisdom. Allah reminded the believers that leadership requires foresight and that mercy must align with divine strategy. Ibn Kathir emphasizes that this correction was instructional, not punitive. Allah was not rebuking compassion. He was refining leadership. A silent shift, the birth of hypocrisy. Before Badr, hypocrisy had no incentive to exist. Islam appeared weak. Public allegiance brought danger, not benefit. After Badr, the situation reversed. Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, whose ambition to rule Madinah had quietly evaporated, now faced a reality he could not ignore. Ibn Ishaq records that only after Badr did he outwardly declare Islam, while inwardly resenting the Prophet, peace be upon him. Thus began a new internal challenge. The enemy was no longer always visible. The Quran would soon expose this disease with unmatched precision, teaching the believers that internal erosion can undo external victory. Makkah's response: humiliation turned into vengeance. While Medina learned governance, Makkah burned with humiliation. Never had Quraysh suffered such a blow. Ibn Kathir describes a city paralyzed by shock. The elite lay dead. The trade routes were threatened. The spiritual prestige of Quraysh had cracked. Abu Sufyan emerged as the strategist of revenge. Public mourning was restricted. Grief was postponed. Resources were redirected. This was not despair. This was preparation. A victory that redefined everything. By the end of this period, Medina was no longer a refuge. It was a state revelation shaped governance in real time. Mercy redefined warfare. Hypocrisy emerged as a new test. Quraysh committed itself to retaliation. Badr had changed the map of Arabia, but the greatest trials were still ahead. Medina under a new gaze. After Badr, Medina was no longer observed casually. Tribes that once dismissed it as a refugee settlement now sent envoys, spies, and merchants with sharper eyes and quieter tongues. The city had become a question mark on the map of Arabia, one that demanded an answer. Ibn Kathir records that delegations passing near Medina began asking the same question repeatedly: who truly holds authority here now? The answer was no longer ambiguous. The Prophet, peace be upon him, was not merely a religious guide. He was the recognized leader of a community that had demonstrated discipline, unity, and resolve. This shift altered every relationship Medina had, internally and externally. The Constitution of Medina, a living document. Although the Constitution of Medina had been established earlier, Badr transformed it from theory into reality. Before Badr, its clauses rested on trust. After Badr, they rested on enforcement. Ibn Ishaq explains that the document defined Medina as one political entity with shared defense obligations and clearly defined responsibilities. Each group now had to choose whether they would honor their covenants, test them, or quietly undermine them. Badr forced that choice. The Jewish tribes reassessed the balance of power. The Jewish tribes of Madinah, Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza were not passive observers of these changes. They were economically influential, politically experienced, and deeply aware of shifting power dynamics. Ibn Kathir notes that Badr unsettled the equilibrium that had previously existed. Long viewed as the ultimate deterrent against Muhammad, peace be upon him, had been publicly humbled. This altered calculations. Support for Quraysh no longer felt secure. Open hostility felt premature. What followed instead was cautious tension. Measured words masking unease. This tension would soon surface. The marketplaces, economics as a battlefield. After Badr, conflict did not immediately erupt through swords. It surfaced through markets. Banu Qaynuqa controlled key trading spaces in Madinah. Their economic dominance was long-standing, and they were skilled craftsmen and traders. Ibn Ishaq records that insults, provocations, and confrontations began to increase in these public spaces. What mattered was not a single incident, but a pattern of escalation. Markets in Arabia were never neutral. They were arenas of honor, influence, and power was changing hands. The Prophet, peace be upon him, and restraint as policy. Despite rising tension, the Prophet, peace be upon him, did not rush toward confrontation. This restraint is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the Sirah. Ibn Sa'd emphasizes that the Prophet, peace be upon him, consistently issued reminders, reaffirmed treaties, sought de-escalation. Authority in Islam was not asserted through intimidation, but through moral clarity and patience. Warnings were given before consequences. This principle would remain consistent throughout the Prophet's life, peace be upon him. The hypocrites find their voice. As Islam's authority grew, so did internal resistance, subtle, calculated, and careful. Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul now occupied a unique position. Outwardly Muslim, inwardly resentful, he recognized that overt opposition would isolate him. Instead, he adopted influence through whispering, hesitation, and doubt. Ibn Ishaq describes him as a man who spoke carefully, chose moments strategically, undermined unity without confronting authority. This was a new kind of opposition, one that required spiritual vigilance rather than military response. The Quran would soon respond to this threat with verses that remain timeless in their insight into human psychology. Surah Al-Anfāl, Obedience After Victory. Among the most profound lessons revealed after Badr was this: victory does not guarantee righteousness. Allah repeatedly emphasizes obedience, unity, and discipline, not courage or numbers. Ibn Kathir explains that these verses were revealed to protect the believers from internal decay, a far greater threat than Quraysh's swords. Disunity after success has destroyed civilizations far greater than Madinah. Islam addressed it at its inception. Quraysh prepares in silence. While Madinah navigated governance, Quraysh prepared with resolve. Public mourning was delayed. Grief was suppressed. Resources were consolidated. Ibn Hisham records that Quraysh redirected caravan profits specifically toward military preparation. Weapons were purchased. Alliances were strengthened. This was not reaction. It was strategy. They understood that delay favored the Muslims. A community learning to lead. For the believers, this period was not one of ease. Leadership demanded restraint. Authority demanded humility. Revelation demanded obedience, even when emotions pulled otherwise. The companions were learning that Islam was not merely about standing firm in hardship, but remaining upright in strength. That lesson would soon be tested. The road ahead becomes clearer. By the end of this period, Medina was politically alert. Internal tensions had surfaced. External enemies were reorganizing. Revelation continued shaping governance. Badr had proven Allah's support. What came next would test the believer's discipline. The Quran guides administration. Shortly after Badr, Allah revealed verses of Surah Al-Anfāl to address the practical and spiritual realities of victory. They ask you about the spoils of war. Say, the spoils belong to Allah and the Messenger, and so that you may learn discipline and obedience. Quran 8:1. Ibn Kathir emphasizes that these verses were not about the spoils alone. They were a lesson in leadership, unity, and humility. Victory is intoxicating. It can inflate ego, divide companions, and generate disputes. By placing authority under divine guidance, the Prophet, peace be upon him, ensured the Ummah's cohesion and set a precedent for governance rooted in obedience to revelation, not personal gain. Distribution of spoils, a lesson in fairness. Badr presented the believers with unprecedented wealth, armor, animals, and goods from Quraysh. This required decisions that had never before faced the young Ummah. The Prophet, peace be upon him, consulted Abu Bakr and Umar radhiyallahu anhuma regarding fair distribution. Should the spoils go to those who fought at the front, or also to those who guarded Medina? Ibn Sa'd narrates, "The Prophet, peace be upon him, did not allow greed to decide. Divine instruction determined the process, teaching the believers that authority is a responsibility, not entitlement. Even the distribution of wealth became a spiritual exercise, strengthening obedience and trust in Allah." Internal challenges. The emergence of hypocrisy. While Medina celebrated and planned, subtle dangers emerged within. Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, a prominent figure who had hoped to dominate Medina, began displaying covert resistance. Outwardly compliant, inwardly resentful, he attempted to influence others through whispering and hesitation. Ibn Ishaq records, "No man's heart burned with envy more than his." The Prophet, peace be upon him, was aware that external victories are only meaningful if internal unity remains intact. These early lessons taught the companions about spiritual vigilance, ethical governance, and the management of dissent. Medina's alliances and strategic position. Badr also altered Medina's strategic relationships. Neighboring tribes observed the victory and reconsidered alliances. Some sought treaties to secure trade routes. Others remained neutral, watching the Muslim state grow. The city's newfound power forced a reevaluation of loyalty and defense obligations. Ibn Kathir notes that Badr effectively transformed Medina from a refugee settlement into a recognized political entity. Quraysh's response, a city humiliated. Makkah experienced a profound shock. Quraysh's elite had been defeated and humiliated. Ibn Hisham describes a city stricken with grief and fear, yet not despair. Abu Sufyan and other Quraysh leaders planned silently, redirecting trade and resources toward eventual retaliation. Public mourning was subdued as they prepared for the next confrontation. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical loss. Medina now commanded respect and caution across the Arabian Peninsula. The spiritual lessons of Badr. Beyond politics and diplomacy, Badr served as a spiritual trial. The companions learned 1. Victory is a responsibility, not reward. 2. Unity requires obedience and humility. 3. Mercy strengthens leadership. 4. Success draws both internal and external tests. Ibn Kathir emphasizes that Allah revealed Surah Al-Anfāl not to glorify combat, but to teach discipline, ethics, and governance. Medina transformed. By the end of this stage, Medina had transitioned from refugee settlement to governing city. Divine guidance shaped post-war decision-making. Mercy, justice, and discipline became pillars of leadership. Internal challenges like hypocrisy emerged alongside external threats. Quraysh began quiet preparations for revenge. Badr had proven Allah's support. But the real test now was sustaining unity, justice, and moral authority in the aftermath of triumph.